Hey everyone. So we are doing part two today of the folly of leadership, and we are back in Second Chronicles. So the rest of the examples are going to include Second Chronicles, and I think we have some really interesting ones to glean from as well. So if you missed part one, I would suggest going back so you can kind of get a bit of like a context because I might be referencing a few things here and there as well. But ultimately, we're dealing with not necessarily the snare of leadership, but some of the things that sometimes are produced as a product of people in a leadership position. So when we say folly, we're dealing with things like foolishness, error, things that technically is something to avoid, but something that often does happen in the context within leadership. Okay, so the first example we're going to be talking about for part two is Second Chronicles 33, and we're dealing with Manasseh. Now, when we did part one, we covered Hezekiah. Hezekiah was our last example, and Hezekiah was a considerably good example in the fact that he I'm sorry, he wasn't the last example. He was the mid example, but last example in Second Chronicles. But specifically, his experience was being a person who was considered good in the eyes of the Lord. Like he did what was right in the sight of the Lord. But when he got sick, he didn't properly acknowledge the Lord. And so this pride it identifies was a snare for him. And he repented and his kingdom lasted for a very long time, and he was highly honored as a king. So Manasseh is his son. So his kind of like, you would say, like, person who's taking over for him. And Hezekiah's son um, did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord. So you will see in Second Chronicles 33, specifically, like there's a lot of things that he does that is like very unpleasing for the Lord. And it mentions things of like, for example, high places. So this is a place that technically was intended to be a place to worship false gods. So Hezekiah had tore them down, Manasseh rebuilt them. And not only that, he also put in places like altars within the temple of the Lord in order to worship false deities. So obviously, this was not well with the Lord. I'm going to go through the text specifically, but additionally, he was also participating in things that like they were told like not to do. So, for example, like dealing with soothsaying, and he sacrificed his sons as human sacrifices. There's a lot of things he did that was wrong before the Lord, and we're going to look at the text because the text will speak even more to that. So, I'm going to start. Um, Yeah, probably just at the beginning. I'm going to probably pull out specific points. I won't read the whole text, but I'm going through Second Chronicles 33, and I'm going from 1 to 18. Sorry, 20. It is fairly long, and that's the reason I'm kind of just going to be pulling out particular points, but I will still have it up on the screen for your convenience. So Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 55 years. He did what was evil in the Lord's sight, following the detestable practices of the pagan nations that the Lord had driven from the land ahead of the Israelites. He rebuilt the pagan shrines his father Hezekiah had broken down. He constructed altars for the images of Baal and set up Asherah poles. He also bowed before all the powers of the heavens and worshiped them. He built pagan altars in the temple of the Lord, the place where the Lord had said, "My name will remain in Jerusalem forever." He built these altars for all the powers of the heavens in both courtyards of the Lord's temple. Manasseh also sacrificed his own sons in the fire in the valley of Ben Hinnom. He practiced sorcery, divination, and witchcraft, and he consulted with mediums and psychics. He did much that was evil in the Lord's sight, arousing his anger. Okay, so let's pause for a minute. Obviously, there's a lot to cover in here. He did a lot of things that were evil in the sight of the Lord. Now, why is this considered like the folly of leadership? Well, considering where he came from, considering he's part of Hezekiah's lineage, considering he's from the line of David. Like, if we want to take all of this into consideration, considering he's supposed to be, a person who is, following what, the people of Israel are intended to follow, considering all of these things, he very quickly departs from the example that Hezekiah laid out for him. Obviously, like, if that's his father, he's going to be um, raised and experienced in some level of the ways of the Lord. So the fact that he departs so quickly, and I mean, he is 12 years old when he takes over, so considerably young, but still not an excuse before the eyes of the Lord to be leading an entire nation and yourself specifically in that direction. So the place that I want to go now is verse 10. So now the Lord is warning him. The Lord spoke to Manasseh and his people, but they ignored all his warnings. So the Lord sent the commanders of the Assyrian armies, and they took Manasseh prisoner. They put a ring through his nose, bound him in bronze chains, and led him away to Babylon. But while in deep distress, Manasseh sought the Lord and sincerely humbled himself before the God of his ancestors. And when he prayed, the Lord listened to him and was moved by his request. So the Lord brought Manasseh back to Jerusalem and his kingdom. Then Manasseh finally realized that the Lord alone is God. Okay, so fast forward to verse 15. Manasseh also removed foreign gods and the idols in the Lord's temple. He tore down the altars he had built on the hill where the temple stood, and all the altars that were in Jerusalem, and he dumped them outside the city. Okay. So in essence, he did like, the Lord was able to course correct him. But again, a bit of the folly of leadership, right? Is like, he's been warned and he's just disregarding it. And it takes him being in a really dire situation and like enslaved for him to realize, oh, God was serious. This is not going to continue going. And so he has to humble himself. And even at the very end, um, verse 20, when Manasseh died, he was buried in his palace. So, as a consequence of all of the things that he had done, he was not buried in a royal cemetery with the kings that were esteemed before the Lord, because of all of his wicked actions and deeds. So, there was still consequence to pay, even though he still had corrected himself, or the Lord had corrected him, sorry. But very shortly thereafter, his son comes along, Ammon, which we're not going to be dealing with his example, but he also does what is evil in the sight of the Lord. So you see again this pattern, like leaders who maybe start right, go wrong, and leaders who start wrong and go right. And I think that definitely speaks to, again, the dynamic nature of leadership, right? Is that it doesn't necessarily mean that, it's always a linear trajectory. It does sometimes vary a bit. Okay, so now we are going to go to Second Chronicles 35. And we're dealing with Josiah. Okay, so in Second Chronicles 34, verse 2, we learn that he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. So this is like kind of backwards, but we're going to be specifically dealing with Second Chronicles 35. He was only 8 years old when he came into kingship. He breaks down the altars and cleanses Judah and Jerusalem. That's verse 4 and 5 in Second Chronicles 34. Josiah restores true worship, based on, like, I mean, in conjunction with a prophet and priest. And then Josiah also has this really large Passover that is highly recognized as well. It's something that is celebrated and acknowledged. But then we go into Second Chronicles 35, verse 20. And this is where Josiah dies. So I'm going to read it, and again, it will be up for your convenience. After Josiah had finished restoring the temple, King Necho of Egypt led his army up from Egypt to do battle at Carmel on the Euphrates River, and Josiah and his army marched out to fight him. But King Necho sent out messengers to Josiah with his message. "What do you want with me, King of Judah? I have no quarrel with you today. I am on my way to fight another nation, and God has told me to hurry. Do not interfere with God, who is with me, or he will destroy you. But Josiah refused to listen to Necho, to whom God had indeed spoken, and he would not turn back. Instead, he disguised himself and led his army into battle on the plain of Megiddo. But the enemy archers hit King Josiah with their arrows and wounded him. He cried out to his men, "Take me from the battle, for I am badly wounded." So they lifted Josiah out of his chariot and placed him in another chariot. Then they brought him back to Jerusalem, where he died. He was buried there in the royal cemetery, and all Judah and Jerusalem mourned for him. So, another interesting example, right? And I mean, so Josiah has this, like, obviously he's very well esteemed amongst the people. And here is this situation where he now gets involved with something that he wasn't maybe intended to get involved with, we can say. He disregarded an instruction that was provided by the king, and he meddled in affairs which did not concern him, and he lost his life as a product of this. So, even in, again, all of the things that were well and he had done right, the Lord was instructing King Necho. And again, I think that speaks to this kind of sometimes pride that creeps in. I don't know if you guys remember, I was discussing this like a few weeks ago about when dealing with like the prophet specifically, like the true prophets experience, the Old Testament piece, where it's like um there's this assumption sometimes that like God only speaks to you. God's not going to tell you everything or show you everything, or he might be using someone else or instructing someone else. So I do feel like this is actually a really great example of that. Is here it is, even a secular pagan king, he knew God was telling him to do something. So there you go. So I guess just also something to heed for future reference as well. If you're ever in those situations, like sometimes I do think, God tests us in this way to see, whether we can discern his voice. And I don't know. My question, I would say, like, again, I don't want to infer too much because there might be a lot of things that I'm not catching either in this, but my question to this would have been like, did Josiah stop and like pause before jumping in? Maybe not. Probably not. Okay. So now our third and final example, we are dealing with Zedekiah. Not Hezekiah, Zedekiah. I know the names. So Second Chronicles 36. And verse 11 again shows us that he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And you'll see also he overlaps with Jeremiah. So he does not humble himself before Jeremiah, who is attempting to provide correction to him. And we see, like, as well, frequent warnings that occur for him. So we are going to read it, and it's going to be up for your convenience. Verse 11. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 11 years. But Zedekiah did what was evil in the sight of the Lord his God, and he refused to humble himself when the prophet Jeremiah spoke to him directly from the Lord. He also rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, even though he had taken an oath of loyalty in God's name. Zedekiah was a hard and stubborn man, refusing to turn to the Lord, the God of Israel. Likewise, all the leaders of the priests and the people became more and more unfaithful. So just like pause, right? Like his behavior, his disobedience impacted the others, right? And this is sometimes something that we diminish in leadership, is like when, yeah, I got to say this one. I'm going to say this. Sometimes we think when leaders are being corrected, we think like, why are you being so harsh on the leader? Even though it specifically tells us in James 3:1 that people who teach are held to a higher standard. There's an influence that comes from leadership. And so sometimes we think the person just departing from the faith, like, well, don't be too hard on them. And it's like, no, this is not about them. This is not about um, them being untouchable. This is also, it involves the people who are listening to this, who are following this, who are influenced by this. Let's keep going. Verse 14, they followed all the pagan practices of the surrounding nations, desecrating the temple of the Lord that had been consecrated in Jerusalem. The Lord, the God of their ancestors, repeatedly sent his prophets to warn them, for he had compassion on his people and his temple. But the people mocked these messengers of God and despised their words. They scoffed at the prophets until the Lord's anger could no longer be restrained and nothing could be done. And so we see later on in the passage that the Lord brings the king of Babylon against them, and ultimately they are enslaved. And the message of the Lord that's spoken through Jeremiah the prophet is fulfilled, and essentially it lies desolate for 70 years as it was fulfilled, just as the prophet had said. Um, yeah. So for further look at the book of Jeremiah, you can kind of go through more of like the warnings that are provided and then where it ends up landing. But I think it again speaks to the folly of leadership, right? Which is even in times of being warned, even in times of repetition, it's so easy to disregard the voice of others and even those who are speaking on behalf of the Lord. Now, I know you might look at this and think like, why would this be necessarily relevant in today times? Why does this even matter? The fact is, just like Ecclesiastes tells us, there's nothing new under the sun. People are people. People do some of the same things. So this is not with the intention to misuse text and say, hey, this is what the leaders in the church are doing. But this is for us to look at these examples and like, okay, well, what happens when there's power that is not properly accounted for? What happens when we have people who are stubborn and hard of heart? Because we can look at this and say, like, this isn't happening in the church. This isn't happening now in the New Testament. There are people who are still bringing in like false occultic messages, soothsayers, mediums. These people are still filtering those messages in. We're still seeing pride frequently. We're still seeing people who are, prophets who are warning, and it's being disregarded, right? Because again, we don't want to hear it. We don't like the message. We don't like the messengers, right? So I do think there's really something important for us to glean right now, because in the other piece of this, I would say my heart breaks for leadership too, because I see so much of their pain when they're doing things. Like they think that it comes across like they're doing things what that is right. And I just see their brokenness, and I see my own brokenness, and I know my own weakness. And so I know that even in their failures, there is a brokenness that's underneath that at the very core. At the very core, we need God. We need him more than we need breath, than we need food, than we need water. We need him more than anything else on this earth. And when we try to depart from his ways, when we try to do things in our own strength, when we use the wrong sources, when we disobey his commandments, we will experience the consequences of those actions. And my prayer is that as you're watching these videos and you're seeing some of the things that have happened in previous situations and capacities, let us learn from it. Let us learn um, that it's easy to start right and go wrong. It's easy to start wrong, and maybe God will correct them and go right. I do think there's opportunity here for us to see leadership in a richer and more, again, dynamic way, where it's not just fixed. And sometimes people, this is something I've seen that's happening a lot, is a lot of people who seem to start right, who appear to start right. They appear to be much more theologically sound. They appear to have a more pure motive and desire. And it's like just watching it fade and watching them slowly distance and fall away from the truth. And it is really sad, and, my prayer for them is that they would come back, and I pray that we continue to be students of the word, like, never coming to a place of trying to be experts, but being constant students. There's so much to learn. I will never be able to do any of this sufficient justice, but I do hope that because sometimes there isn't, um what we see around, sometimes we don't really get to pull into certain texts as often as we might like. And that's my hope, is that there is um more rounded space for us to have conversations about other scriptures and not just like the ones that people tend to talk about the most. Like, I don't want to just fixate on Genesis and the book of Matthew and Galatians. As beautiful as these books are, there's so much to the Bible. There's still so much for us to learn. And I know that if God wrote these books, all scripture is breathed by God. It's by no private interpretation. If God gave them to us, then there's something for us to learn. So let us learn from them, and I hope we grow together. So feel free to put your comments in if you feel like I missed something, if you feel like you have something to add. I also mutually want people to feel like they can disagree, they can have different opinions, and let's talk about it. Let's chat. Have a great day, guys. Night, wherever you are. Bye.